Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today, in the first segment, we're going to introduce algorithmic literacy for journalists. We'll share resources to help journalists and newsrooms confront power imbalances by promoting industry accountability and public understanding. Our guest today is none other than Andy Lee Roth, no stranger to the Project Censored audience. Andy Lee Roth is now editor-at-large for Project Censored. He was associate director for a very long time. So he is editor-at-large for Project Censored and our publishing imprint, The Censored Press. He is co-editor of the Project State of the Free Press yearbook series, co-author of The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people. Roth began working with the project back in 2006, and he served as associate director between 2012 and 2024. During that time, Andy helped coordinate and expand the project's campus affiliates program, which provides hands-on critical media literacy training for students at colleges and universities across North America. More recently, as a 2024-2025 Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellow, Roth developed Algorithmic Literacy for Journalists, which is our topic today, which is a web-based set of practical resources to help journalists promote industry accountability and public understanding of how artificial intelligence systems are revolutionizing journalism and those systems' potential for perpetuating biases, inequalities, and other risks. Andy, of course, also has taught courses in sociology at Sonoma State University, Pomona College, and Citrus College. His research and writing has been published in numerous outlets, including Index on Censorship, In These Times, Yes Magazine, Truth Out, the Progressive Media Culture and Society International Journal for Press and Politics. And he has a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles, a BA in sociology and anthropology from Haverford College. He serves on the boards of the Media Freedom Foundation, Weave News, and the Censored Press. Andy, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
Thanks, Mickey. It's a pleasure to join you once again.
It is wonderful to have you here, and I really, reading how much that you have done over the years, certainly with Project Censored and beyond, it is always it always feels like a great list of accomplishments. And in the past year, you had the great honor of being only one of a dozen fellows for the Reynolds Journalism Institute, and the project that you spearheaded with a team of folks that you put together from Project Censored. It was introducing algorithmic literacy for journalists, which, by the way, everybody out there listening, you can go to the website that Andy and our team helped build. The Project Censored team built this. It's Algorithmic Literacy for Journalists, or ALFJ.org. And so a lot of the things that Andy's going to be talking about today, you can learn about at that website. So, Andy, tell us about this. Tell us about how you started the project, and let's talk more, broadly. Introduce to us, why do we need algorithmic literacy, and why do journalists particularly need this this information?
Well, really, two things motivated the project. One was a sense that algorithms are pervasive in our day-to-day lives, but we often don't recognize their role in guiding us to some information and away from other kinds of information. So from a kind of media literacy standpoint, algorithmic literacy is something everyone needs. We're all using search engines. We're all subject to various forms of recommendation systems that are driven by algorithms. So internet search is not a neutral thing. It's the results you get when you search for something like moon is made of green cheese, or wild caber strikes, is going to be determined by an algorithm, and that algorithm is the proprietary, that is intellectual property of, in all likelihood, a big tech company. So I had written a few years ago about the idea that this was a new form of gatekeeping that didn't involve human editors at newspapers, but involved these algorithmic systems controlled and developed and owned by big tech companies. We're shaping the flow of information and our access to news and perspective So that's kind of the critical media literacy basis for the project. But the other thing that motivated the proposal that we sent to the Reynolds Journalism Institute about this time last year um, was that I was frustrated that a lot of the journalism about algorithms and AI systems often kind of took the perspective of industry. And what I had this kind of vague sense of and frustration about, it turns out other people had been studying systematically. Um, and, for instance, there are two computer scientists at Princeton University, Arvind Narayanan and Yash Kapoor, who talk about pitfalls that AI journalism is regularly undermined by, these recurrent kind of problems in reporting. And that was really the impetus for the idea that, well, there could be a project here. There might be something that would fit with Project Censored's long-standing interests in exposing and opposing censorship on one hand, and its efforts to promote critical media literacy on the other hand, kind of came together with this project, with the twist being that most of the work that I've done prior with the project, and that the project has really been its wheelhouse for so long, has been educational in classrooms. And the proposal that we put together for the Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellowship was saying, let's bring these tools to journalists, which is kind of a little bit of maybe an arrogant or misguided thing to do. Like, no, don't tell journalists that they aren't information literate, right? So one of the challenges was to create resources that would dovetail what journalists all, their existing expertise, and also acknowledge the fact that journalists, much like teachers, work on, incredibly tight time pressure. And so everything that we created for the website, alfj.org, had to be like bite-sized, ready to be snacked on and put to use really quickly, rather than being kind of a dissertation on the subject.
Which, by the way, listeners out there, you can see that work at alfj.org to see what Andy's talking about. And this is, I think, what's also so brilliant about it is that it is very digestible. It is literally made to be used and adopted readily by people in newsrooms. And I know that you've done webinars and you're going to be doing a series of workshops. This is something that I think is, as part of that Project Censored mission, critical media literacy education, this is something that you could really be spreading to schools, colleges, universities, journalism schools, in addition to newsrooms across the country, because the kinds of subjects that you're addressing really are part of our kind of 21st century gatekeeping, forms of censorship, how definitions of censorship have kind of morphed and changed. And you talk about this in a series of articles that you did for the Reynolds Journalism Institute. And you mentioned that ALFJ not only explains how shadow bans, advertising block lists, and other forms of online content reduction can restrict journalists and newsrooms from reaching wider audiences, you write, but it also provides resources for mitigating the impacts of algorithmic gatekeeping. You talk about shadow banning and block lists. You also talk about what are called DIY algorithm audits. There's a lot of things that you actually go through here, including a bias meter at newspapers that we'll get into in a little while, but which is a very fascinating concept. But maybe could you talk a little bit about a couple of those concepts? Because we've certainly talked about shadow banning and we've talked about block lists, and you've written about those for the project before. How do those tie in here?
Yeah. Before I do that, let me say, give a shout out to two important people in terms of the accessibility of this project and how my own thinking about it was shaped by input from other people. I want to acknowledge Kat Duncan at the Reynolds Journalism Institute, who consistently challenged me to make everything that I had to say about this actionable. That's the word that I will always associate with Kat at RJI. What's actionable about this, Andy? And as a classroom teacher, it was hard for me. I always want to explain how things work and why, right? That kind of intellectual curiosity, right? And Kat Duncan would always ask me, okay, for a journalist who's you're helping understand this, what's the action? What's the takeaway? And so if the website has practical utility, part of that is due to the great influence of Kat Duncan at RJI. The other person I want to quickly shout out to, and then we'll talk some about content reduction, is within Project Censored, our colleague Kate Horgan, who developed the website. And one of the big challenges that Kate and I have actually written an article partly about was making a set of sometimes complex ideas and information, making that information easy to navigate and easy to absorb and make your own. And Kate's web design, I think, really facilitates that. And so a shout out to her. So the flip side of something being accessible is it being inaccessible. And that's three of the core modules of algorithmic literacy for journalism address different forms of inaccessibility, different forms of what people who study AI and journalism and the intersection of the two talk about as content reduction. And so these are strategies or tactics that are used mainly by social media platforms, but we also see evidence of them in how internet search works that highlight some content while downplaying or burying other forms of content. And so when we talk about shadow bans, for instance, we're talking in the realm of social media about a very nefarious, I think, form of de facto censorship, where the person whose content is being reduced, right? The visibility of it is being reduced, isn't necessarily aware that that's happening. That's the shadow part of shadow banning. So content is being restricted, but in a way that is not evident to the person whose content it is. And this happens to all kinds of content creators on social media across a variety of areas, but it also affects especially news outlets, independent news outlets that cover issues that might be deemed in violation of community standards by those social media platforms. So for instance, the Kansas City Defender is a newspaper that does a lot to cover police violence and systemic racism in the communities that the Defender serves. And their social media content is often subject to shadow banning. And so we, working with people at the Kansas City Defender and other places and studying, widely, we came up with a set of guidelines for people who, for newsrooms in particular, who believe that their content has been subject to shadow banning. I add the believe there because one of the problems is no social media platform is ever going to tell you, oh, yes, we've been shadow banning your content because it violates community standards. So a beginning point is to understand, for instance, the platform's guidelines. And we have a handful of 5 specific recommendations about how to respond to shadow banning, everything from using content warnings to considering bypass practices, and of course, monitoring engagement. So those kinds of things are the kind of practical, actionable items that we're trying to promote, not only for journalists who are doing news reporting, but also for newsroom managers and editors who are responsible for getting content out to audiences, not only via traditional means, but also using social media as a crucial way of accessing audiences.
And I know, Andy, we have certainly talked about shadow banning, and many of the people that we've worked with over the years in independent media have experienced various versions of this, some of them rather extraordinary. And of course, we've also talked about demonetization and other forms of deplatforming as censorship. And here we see shadow banning. And I think the key here to that concept is that the person that it's happening to, the outlet that it's happening to, is largely unaware of it. I mean, they may gradually become aware of it, but then they don't have any answers for it. And so this is what you've produced here is sort of a way to better understand that. And again, back to the actionable part, things that can be done, things that organizations can do to maybe bypass that. A couple of
Sure.
other things. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Fine. Go
Yep.
ahead.
So, I want to get into a couple of other concepts. I know we've talked about advertising block lists and terms and things before, and I also want to talk about the bias meter. One of the things that we just talked about was advertising block lists, and we also want to talk about biases. Can you explain to our listeners again what is an advertising block list?
Well, so this is the kind of the intersection, truly, like we're into kind of what scholars would talk about as political economy here. Um, Advertising block lists minimize the revenues that news outlets, newsrooms can generate from the content they produce. And so they're a form of content reduction, and they work. Well, there are multiple steps here. What happens is advertisers say, we don't want our products associated with certain kinds of content. Organizations that manage advertising block lists representing those advertisers scan news for objectionable content and then say, no advertising money here. So a revenue stream for a small newsroom potentially dries up when a block list flags content they're producing as violating the advertiser's sense of brand safety is the term that gets used.
Yes, certainly something that if
This
Herman were still with us, he's definitely part of the propaganda model, a 21st century kind of modification of how this impacts news reporting.
Yeah, this is a form of filtering. I think so. It works in two ways. There's the direct way, which we've just talked about, but it also has an indirect kind of chilling effect as well. Because if a newsroom editor knows that when they report on, say, humanitarian crises, a big company like Visa is not likely to have their advertising money associated with something like famine in Africa, there may be a chilling effect on the kinds of stories that an editor will want to run or run prominently. So we talk about advertising block lists as having these kind of dual, like direct and indirect effects, and news avoidance is one of the indirect effects. And so ultimately, I think block lists can undermine the efficacy of online journalism. And all that is by way of saying, well, there are a number of things. Newsrooms are not in control on these, but there are a number of things that they can do to evade or minimize the impacts of block lists. And we recommend 9 concrete items on the ALFJ website, including innovations like the opposite of a block list is an inclusion list. And so there are ways to promote inclusion lists that allow advertisers to focus their ad spend on high quality websites that align with their brand values. I'm sounding like a business person when I use that language, but that's the way it often gets talked about. So inclusion lists help advertisers distinguish between quality journalism on one hand and what gets described as MFAs or made for advertising websites on the other hand. So again, the idea is to empower newsrooms, especially smaller independent newsrooms, to deal with some of these new algorithmically driven technological challenges that are revolutionizing how journalism is, how journalism is produced and consumed.
Yeah, absolutely. And another element that you delve into here in the project is you referenced you did a piece called System Error as part of the series for your fellowship at RJI. And you talk about learning from a newspaper's plan to deploy an AI-powered bias meter. Now, look, in nearly the past decade, We've been ensconced in this moral panic of fake news and bias in the news, and we've seen all kind of efforts to sort of rate or judge the news, where seemingly third parties would judge or rate biases and so forth. This example, and we've talked all about the problems with some of that stuff, however arguably well-intentioned someone might claim. But this is different. This is you looked at the LA Times, right, as an example, where the billionaire owner of the LA Times, right, wanted to incorporate an AI powered bias meter into the newspaper's reporting. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, in some ways, this exemplifies why a project like algorithmic literacy for journalists is so pertinent now. So step back a couple steps here. The LA Times has been owned since 2018 by Patrick Soon-Shiong, who is a medical doctor and a biotech billionaire. He is although he doesn't get as much attention as Jeff Bezos and some of the other big media, our contemporary media plutocrats do. Soon-Shiong is one of them. As we commented in the 2023 yearbook, Mickey, talking about these billionaire, media lords, they blur the lines between journalism and entertainment and consumption. So in the case of Soon-Shiong and the LA Times, things started to heat up last November around the presidential election when he blocked the paper's editorial board's decision to they wanted to endorse Kamala Harris in the presidential race, and Soon-Shiong blocked that. That led to pushback from the LA Times Guild, the union that represents most of the journalists and other staffers at the paper. It led to a wave of resignations, and I think in some ways this got the owner mad, and he decided the way he was going to stick it to him. He floated in a December a podcast interview that they were developing this bias meter that they were going to use on their own reporting to indicate whether there was bias within the reporting of the LA Times staff. And so I wrote an article about this for the RJI project that made three basic points. At the time I wrote the article, it looked like nothing was going to happen with this so-called bias meter, right? He had mentioned it in this kind of podcast. It had gotten a round of disapproval, and then several months went by. But I was interested in it because even if it didn't come out, I thought that the very idea of talking about a bias meter imposed on a paper's journalists without their consultation, without their endorsement, seemed off, right? From a labor standpoint, but also from an algorithmic literacy standpoint. Some problems. News is never a simple reflection of a fixed reality. That's like critical media literacy 101 applied to journalism, right? It requires interpretation. And so the idea that we're going to get rid of interpretation and have a more pure form of news is sort of fantastic in the literal sense of that term, like it's fantasy. Another thing, and I talked to experts, people like Jack Bandy, who is a computer scientist at Transylvania University. Trust requires concrete explanations, not a kind of what Soon-Shiong was talking about back in December and what they've actually now implemented. They rolled it out earlier this month, is a 5-point scale. And every article that expresses, according to Soon-Shiong, an opinion at the LA Times is going to be rated according to this 5-point scale of whether it's left, center, right, or right. And when I talked to Jack Bandy about this, he's actually used large language models, forms of AI, to look at and try to understand political bias in reporting. But his reaction was, this is so simple, it doesn't really explain anything. It's a metric. It puts a label on something, but it doesn't explain anything. And that leads to the third point. If it doesn't explain anything, the whole thing that Sung Shang is touting about this new system is that it's going to build reader trust. It's going to re-engage the LA Times flagging audience. But the trouble is, like, you're using a proprietary algorithm that isn't transparent, that therefore has a lack of accountability, and you're going to rebuild trust that way?
What's the bias in the bias meter, in other words?
Yeah. And this is one of, this is a major point of a kind of critical media literacy applied to algorithms and AI systems more generally, is that if those systems are trained on faulty materials, for instance, that already reflect societal biases and inequalities, those very systems will reproduce those inequalities.
Right.
So and if they're proprietary and we don't know what material they're based on or how they were trained, whether the way they were trained followed ethical standards or not, then we're really, we're in a conundrum in terms of, should we trust this? Is this trustworthy? So, it's long been a kind of goal that we could use AI tech to get at news slant. But I think, if you look now at what's happening at the LA Times since they implemented this, the kind of critical feedback they're getting, it's working about the way you would expect it would if you know some of the basic criticisms of how AI systems work and how they're capable of reproducing pre-existing biases.
Well, maybe these billionaire owners of the press, AJ Liebling, freedom of the press belongs only to those who own one. Jeff Bezos maybe should apply the bias meter to himself, because he just went in and imposed the rule that, that they had to report favorably about free markets and individual liberties. And we've already seen, we saw an award-winning editorial cartoonist have her work dismissed, and she left the paper. Now we have another editor saying that they weren't going to go along with this. They packed up and left. I mean, we're seeing overt biases. We don't need some sophisticated machine. Anybody paying it half of attention that has a pulse can see that this is going on.
Yeah, when all your editorial staff resigns or takes buyouts, that might be that might be the most effective bias meter, and it's not algorithmic, it's human. The same thing has happened. It's not getting as much attention, but the same thing has happened at the LA Times. Earlier, last month, I guess. So in February, Columbia Journalism Review reported that the last human member of the editorial board at the LA Times left. I emphasize human there because, we were joking about this before we started. It may be that Sung Shang is going to need AI because there aren't going to be any humans left on the editorial staff to do the work. I'm joking.
No.
And it's more serious. It's probably not something I should joke about, but there are real problems here. And this goes to one of the things that when we get kind of AI boosterism, it often doesn't address as one of the pitfalls, the devaluing of human labor.
Unbelievable.
And so, respect and a shout out to the unionized members of the LA Times who continue to push back against what Sung Shang is trying to do to that newspaper, which has a prestigious and well-deserved reputation from its past, but isn't, in my opinion, headed in the right direction today under the leadership of, this kind of contemporary era plutocrat and his misguided understandings of, the intersections of journalism and technology and the whole ball of wax.
Well, Andy Lee Roth, this is all the more reason we need algorithmic literacy and algorithmic literacy for journalists. Your work as a fellow this past year for the Reynolds Journalism Institute, developing the website alfj.org, Algorithmic Literacy for Journalists. You can learn more there. You can see all the articles. You can take a deep dive into all this and see the work that Andy and the team he put together. Amazing work that they've done just in the last 6 to 8 months. Andy, any last words, anything else you'd like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I mean, I think just quickly, the some of the cardinal commitments of journalism at its best, not always, but at its best, are to transparency and accountability, right? And that's something that I think one of my takeaways from this project is that that's something that distinguishes journalism from any AI system you could develop, right? AI systems can't explain how they arrived at the outputs that they produce. But if we query an editor or a journalist and say, why'd you choose these sources? Why'd you frame the story this way? They can provide answers. And if we're talking about rebuilding trust in journalism, which I think is a major concern these days, I don't think AI is the way forward. I think reminding people of journalism's cardinal ethical commitments is the way forward. So
Yeah.
this isn't to bash on all AI and not to say there isn't a time and a place for use of AI systems. We all benefit from them in our everyday lives, but just to say that we need to pause and think critically, especially when we're receiving all the hype about how this system is going to transform things or undo generations of bias and inequality. We should put on our critical media literacy thinking caps then and really question and dig on what's the evidence for that.
Absolutely. Andy Lee Roth, thank you so much for sharing all of this amazing work with us and the Project Censored audience today. Andy Lee Roth, editor at large at Project Censor, also the 2024-25 Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellow, and the force behind algorithmic literacy for journalists at alfj.org. Andy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mickey.